the most bizarre punishments from medieval Europe. Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to a time when justice was loud, messy, and occasionally involved livestock. So, get comfortable. Dim the lights. Let your shoulders relax. Maybe wrap yourself in a blanket that doesn't smell like damp hay. And together, we'll wander slowly through some of the most curious punishments medieval Europe had to offer. Because let's be honest, if there's one thing our ancestors excelled at, other than plagues and questionable dentistry, it was coming up with highly creative ways to discourage bad behavior. Now, before we start, let's clear something up. Punishment in the Middle Ages wasn't really about rehabilitation. Nobody was sending thieves to group therapy or asking arsonists to reflect on their childhood trauma. Justice was spectacle. It was about being seen. The point wasn't just to make someone suffer, it was to make everyone else watch them suffer, and ideally think, maybe I won't steal that goose after all. And so, punishments became a sort of grim performance art. Equal parts discipline, theater, and, in some cases, community entertainment. Take, for example, the cucking stool. Essentially, a glorified dunk tank, except instead of clowns making sarcastic remarks at a carnival, you had local women accused of gossip or scolding. The convicted would be strapped to a wooden chair, usually attached to a long beam, and dunked repeatedly in a river or pond. Cold water, mud, humiliation, it was less about pain and more about public shame. And of course, the crowd loved it. Nothing says village bonding quite like watching your neighbor get repeatedly submerged until her hat floats away. Naturally, the Tudors, because they never missed an opportunity for unnecessary ceremony, perfected this into something called the ducking stool. Same principle, more structure, a bit sturdier. Because why simply dunk your neighbor when you can engineer it with style? But not all punishments were watery. Some were sticky. Very sticky. Let's drift gently toward the delightful medieval pastime of tar and feathering. Now, while technically more common in later centuries, the roots of this rather unpleasant punishment stretch back to the medieval world. It was simple, really. Take a wrongdoer, cover them in hot tar, then roll them in feathers like a very angry chicken nugget. The humiliation was worse than the burns, though make no mistake, the burns were real. Imagine being paraded through town as a feathered monstrosity, while children point and cackle. Rehabilitation? No. Memorable? Absolutely. And then, of course, there was the pillory. Ah yes, the medieval public's favorite wooden photo frame. 3 holes, 1 for your head, 2 for your arms, and you were locked in place, on display for hours, sometimes days. The goal was shame, but the reality was often worse. Passers-by were encouraged to throw things, rotten vegetables, dead animals, mud. Basically anything unpleasant within arm's reach. If you were unlucky, it wasn't vegetables being thrown, but something more organic. Let's just say chamber pots were rarely far from hand. So, there you stood, aching, filthy, pelted, and entirely unable to scratch your nose. But medieval Europe wasn't content with wood and mud alone. Sometimes punishment meant fashion, forced fashion. One of my personal favorites is the practice of making criminals wear special, humiliating clothing. In some German towns, a baker who cheated customers might be forced to parade around in a giant loaf of bread tied around his neck. Because nothing says "I'll measure your flour properly next time" like a bread-based necklace. Elsewhere, people accused of adultery might be made to wear horns on their heads. Subtle, right? As if the whispers weren't enough, now you're literally branded with the medieval version of a novelty hat. And for people who sold watered-down beer, a crime that, frankly, might deserve harsher punishment than many others, they could be forced to drink their own inferior brew until they vomited. Which, one imagines, was both unpleasant and somewhat effective. Now, one of the more theatrical forms of punishment was something called riding the stang. This was essentially a ritual of public shaming where the guilty party, sometimes a man accused of domestic cruelty, was paraded through town on a wooden pole, often backwards, while the crowd jeered. Sometimes he wasn't even the one on the pole, occasionally a proxy stood in, while his shame was loudly proclaimed. Think of it as medieval performance art, with just a hint of mob justice. And of course, animals occasionally got in on the act. You may have heard of animal trials, and yes, they were exactly what they sound like. Medieval courts, with all their solemnity, sometimes put pigs, cows, or even insects on trial for crimes like crop destruction or child mauling. The animals could be sentenced to execution or exile. Imagine sitting in a wooden courtroom while a lawyer earnestly argues against a particularly aggressive pig. Absurd? Certainly. But also, very medieval. Then there were the punishments that weren't just humiliating, they were downright exhausting. Take the treadmill. No, not the modern kind with motivational playlists and overpriced sports drinks. This was a massive wooden wheel that prisoners were forced to walk on for hours, generating labor for mills or construction. Walk too slowly, and you risked injury. Walk too long, and you collapsed. It was work disguised as punishment, or perhaps punishment disguised as work. Either way, it was monotonous misery. But not every punishment involved physical pain. Some were purely symbolic. For example, in certain towns, a cheating merchant could be forced to stand before the church holding his faulty goods aloft, as if saying, "Yes, I am the world's worst cobbler, and here is the proof." The public humiliation, the loss of reputation, that was the real punishment. Because in medieval society, reputation was everything. Still, some punishments managed to be both symbolic and very, very physical. Take the practice of breaking on the wheel. Reserved for the most serious crimes, the condemned was tied to a cartwheel and bludgeoned limb by limb until bones shattered. Now, this one is grim. But even here, there was a performative aspect. The wheel was often hoisted up after the deed, displaying the broken body like some kind of grotesque warning sign. Because medieval justice was nothing if not thorough in its messaging. But before we drift too darkly into the realm of executions, let's return to the odd, the bizarre, the slightly ridiculous. Because medieval Europe truly had no shortage of inventive punishments. There were masks of shame, iron contraptions shaped like animal heads or grotesque faces, strapped to the offender to mock their supposed sin. Imagine having to wear a pig-faced mask through town because you were caught lying. Subtlety, as always, was not the medieval way. And perhaps the strangest punishment of all? Sometimes the punishment was simply banishment. To us, that may not sound odd, but in the close-knit, rigidly hierarchical medieval world, exile was devastating. To be cut off from your village, your community, your livelihood, that was social death. And yet, it was administered with less drama than dunking stools or feather parades. Just a quiet order, leave, and never return. So there we have it. A small sampling of the medieval imagination at work in the realm of punishment. Humiliation, spectacle, pain, and occasionally comedy, woven together in ways only our inventive ancestors could manage. And of course, as we drift further into this night, we'll wander on, to yet more curious practices, more royal oddities, more lives both tragic and absurd. But for now, picture a medieval square at twilight. The pillory empty. The cucking stool creaking by the water's edge. A loaf of bread hung mockingly in the town stocks. The crowd dispersing, their curiosity sated. And in the quiet, only the lingering echo of laughter and shame remains. More curious punishments and peculiar justice. So, we're still here, in medieval Europe, wandering among punishments that ranged from laughably theatrical to, well, slightly horrifying. The torches have dimmed. The square is quieter. And yet, there's always another story. Because, of course, medieval justice was nothing if not inventive. Let's ease into it with something oddly domestic, the scold's bridle. Picture an iron cage, fitted around the head, with a little metal plate that pressed down on the tongue. It was used mostly on women accused of being too outspoken. Which, in practice, could mean anything from actual slander, to simply pointing out that your husband was useless. The effect was simple: you couldn't talk, you looked ridiculous, and everyone got the point. Imagine bumping into your neighbor at the market, both of you awkwardly avoiding eye contact, while she jingles slightly from the iron muzzle strapped to her head. A very medieval version of keep your opinions to yourself. Now, if humiliation by ironwork wasn't enough, there was always the option of parading criminals around town in carts. This was common for petty thieves or fraudsters. They'd be hauled around slowly, sometimes backwards, while a town crier shouted their crimes. Think of it as a sort of medieval press release, except instead of a statement on parchment, you got dragged through mud while everyone pointed. And let's not forget about the drunkards. Oh, medieval Europe had a particular fondness for punishing drunkenness. In some towns, offenders had to wear what was called a drunkard's cloak. Essentially, a barrel with holes cut for the head and arms. The sight was so absurd that the shame alone was meant to sober you up. Imagine stumbling around in public, encased in wood, looking like a confused turtle, while your fellow villagers chuckle. Effective? Perhaps not. Memorable? Absolutely. Then there were the punishments that tried, in their way, to be poetic. A baker who sold short-weight bread might have to be baked, well, not literally, but placed in his own oven for a while, with the heat turned up just enough to terrify him. Nothing like the smell of slightly singed eyebrows to remind you to measure your flour honestly. In other cases, bakers were tied to carts and dragged through the streets with loaves of bread strung around their necks, which was probably less terrifying but more amusing to the crowd. But what about those who fought too much? In some places, quarrelsome neighbors were forced to carry heavy stones through the streets, symbolizing the weight of their arguments. Or, for couples known for domestic squabbles, they might be tied together and forced to work in public while bound at the wrist. A sort of medieval couples therapy, though perhaps not the most effective. We should also talk about the punishments reserved for dishonest merchants, because medieval society took trade very seriously. A miller who cheated with weights could find himself locked in stocks with the false weights dangling mockingly around his neck. A butcher who sold rotten meat might have the offending product burned beneath his nose until he gagged. And in some towns, cheating was literally branded, marks seared into the flesh to declare your dishonesty permanently. Which, of course, had the convenient side effect of making it hard to find new customers. And while we're drifting through markets and public squares, let's pause at one of the stranger spectacles: punishments involving animals. Beyond animal trials, there were cases where offenders were made to ride donkeys backwards through town. A thief, for example, might be placed facing the donkey's tail, holding its tail like reins, while everyone laughed at the ridiculous sight. The symbolism was simple: you behaved like a fool, now you ride like one. Some punishments were deliberately disgusting. Take the practice of making a convicted liar wear a necklace of dead fish. The smell, the humiliation, the sheer inconvenience, it all worked together to remind you that perhaps honesty really was the best policy. Or at least the least smelly one. And then, of course, we have the good old-fashioned flogging. A classic. Whipping was common across Europe, often carried out in public squares. But what's interesting is how varied the practice could be. Some towns prescribed exact numbers, 39 lashes, for example, because 40 seemed excessive, but 38 just wouldn't make the point. Others tied the number of lashes to the severity of the crime. Either way, it was loud, painful, and memorable. And the onlookers, as always, were expected to take notes. Figuratively, of course. Literacy was not widespread. Let's not overlook the punishments that blended humiliation with mild inconvenience. Like being forced to crawl through the streets on all fours, sometimes carrying a stone on your back. Or being ordered to kiss the ground at the church door in front of everyone. Little acts of degradation that stuck in the memory long after the actual pain had faded. One of the more peculiar punishments was known as shaming by proclamation. Essentially, the town crier would walk around shouting your crime loudly in public places. It was verbal stocks. You didn't have to stand anywhere, but your reputation was locked in place nonetheless. And in a world where community reputation was everything, that could cut deeper than any whip. And if all else failed, there was always mutilation. Fingers chopped off for thieves. Ears cropped for repeat offenders. Branding on the cheek or forehead. Brutal, yes, but also practical, like a walking criminal record. The message was clear: this man has sticky fingers. Proceed with caution. Of course, the grim humor of all this is that punishments didn't always deter crime. If anything, they provided a steady stream of entertainment for the bored townsfolk. You might not remember the sermon at church that week, but you'd certainly remember when your neighbor got paraded around in a barrel. So, as we drift here in the quiet night, think of medieval justice not as cold efficiency, but as theater. Every punishment had an audience. Every humiliation was meant to be witnessed. and every bizarre ritual was stitched into the fabric of everyday life. The scold's bridle hanging in the corner of the courthouse. The drunkard stumbling in his barrel cloak. The donkey waiting patiently to carry yet another fool backwards through the streets. All part of the strange, uncomfortable, and oddly creative world of medieval punishment. And from here, we'll drift onward to yet more curiosities, more eccentric rulers, and the peculiar lives they led. The grand theatrical executions. So far, we've wandered through the lighter, more humiliating side of medieval justice, iron muzzles, wooden barrels, and the occasional donkey ride. But medieval Europe also specialized in something a little more dramatic. Public executions. Because nothing said "don't try this at home" like dragging a crowd into the town square to watch someone's insides become their outsides. Now, before we drift too deep, let's remember, this was theater. Grim theater, yes, but theater nonetheless. Everyone had a role. The condemned, of course, was the unwilling star. The executioner played the part of the grim professional. The clergy stood nearby to remind everyone that God was definitely keeping score. And the crowd, well, the crowd did what crowds always do. They murmured. They gawked. They pretended to be horrified while not so secretly enjoying the day's grim entertainment. Let's start with the classic, hanging. Simple, portable, and endlessly versatile. In its most basic form, you tied a rope, dropped a person, and waited. In wealthier towns, there might even be a permanent gallows outside the walls, a kind of grim billboard that said, "Welcome to town. Don't steal our chickens." But hanging wasn't always so straightforward. Sometimes the drop was too short, leaving the victim to dangle and struggle in front of the crowd. Other times, the rope snapped, which many interpreted as divine intervention. The executioner, however, usually interpreted it as "fetch another rope." Then there was beheading. In theory, it was swift, merciful, and dignified. Reserved for nobles who, naturally, deserved cleaner deaths than the peasants. But the flaw in this system was human error. Executioners weren't always highly trained. Sometimes the axe was dull. Sometimes the angle was off. The result? 2, 3, even 4 swings before the job was finished. Hardly dignified. There's a story of one poor soul who, after several botched chops, actually looked up at the executioner as if to say, "Really?" For the truly spectacular crimes, treason, rebellion, or just seriously annoying the wrong monarch, there was hanging, drawing, and quartering. The process was as long as its name. First, you were dragged on a hurdle through the streets, bumping along in front of jeering crowds. Then you were hanged, but not long enough to die. Cut down, you'd be disemboweled in front of everyone. The executioner might hold up your organs like grim party favors. Finally, your body would be chopped into 4 neat pieces, with your head displayed separately, often on a spike. A kind of medieval public service announcement, except much bloodier. Burning at the stake was another favorite, particularly for heresy. The symbolism was clear, flames consuming both body and soul. In practice, it was less clean. Green would smoke terribly, suffocating the victim before the fire even truly caught. Dry would burn fast and hot. And sometimes, in a bizarre show of mercy, friends would tie little bags of gunpowder around the condemned's neck so the explosion would kill them quickly. Nothing says caring community quite like preemptively blowing up your neighbor at their execution. We should also mention breaking on the wheel. A particularly theatrical punishment used more on the continent than in England. The condemned was tied to a large wagon wheel, and their limbs were systematically smashed with a hammer or iron bar. Then the body was woven between the spokes and left to die, displayed for all to see. A kind of grotesque scarecrow, but instead of frightening birds, it frightened anyone considering petty theft. And let's not forget boiling. Yes, sometimes people were literally boiled alive in huge cauldrons, usually as punishment for poisoning. There's a grim sort of logic there, like a culinary version of poetic justice. A crime of the kitchen answered with a punishment of the pot. The smell, apparently, was unforgettable. Executioners themselves became strange figures in this drama. Part celebrity, part outcast. No one wanted to shake their hand, but everyone knew their face. They lived on the edges of towns, sometimes performing other tasks like disposing of animal carcasses or cleaning the latrines, because once you've chopped off a few heads, apparently everything unpleasant is fair game. Yet despite the horror, many executioners were considered skilled professionals, even inheriting the role across generations, as though decapitation were just another family trade. And then there was the afterlife of the body. Heads on spikes. Quarters of traitors displayed at city gates. Sometimes boiled in tar to preserve them from decay. Travelers passing through would see them swaying gently in the wind, a reminder that defying authority rarely ended well. Children, no doubt, grew up thinking of them as normal city decorations. Medieval urban planning at its finest. But here's the quiet irony: despite all the spectacle, all the effort to terrify, crime didn't stop. People still stole bread. Still quarreled. Still rebelled. The punishments shocked, but they didn't reform. At most, they gave everyone something to talk about on market day. Did you see the execution? Oh yes, messy business. Pass the turnips. And so the cycle continued. Rope, axe, fire, wheel. Over and over. Each execution meant to send a message. Each message largely ignored. As we drift here in the stillness of night, it's hard not to see the absurdity. The grim theater of it all. Townspeople gathering as though for a festival, only the entertainment was someone else's agony. Monarchs imagining they were keeping order, when in reality they were simply feeding a cycle of cruelty and spectacle. It is, in a way, the perfect medieval contradiction. Faith on Sunday. Violence on Monday. Piety in the morning. Blood at noon. And life went on, as it always did. So let's leave the gallows now, and the smell of smoke, and the wheel creaking in the wind. We'll drift quietly away from the noise of the square. Toward softer curiosities. Toward the lives of monarchs themselves, their oddities, their fragile dynasties, and the peculiar burdens they carried. The most inbred monarchs in European history. Hey everyone, let's drift on. We've wandered past gallows and smoke, so let's move now into quieter chambers. Gilded halls. Long banquet tables. And dynasties where the family trees, well, let's just say they weren't so much trees as very confused shrubs. Because medieval and early modern monarchs had one favorite pastime, apart from war and badly funded crusades: marrying their cousins. Over. And over. And over again. Dynastic purity, they called it. Keeping the bloodline pure. What it really meant was that after a few centuries, half the royal courts of Europe were limping around with the same jawline, the same vacant stare, and the same unfortunate genetic lottery tickets. Let's start gently, with Spain. The Habsburgs. A family so thoroughly inbred that their portraits look less like proud rulers and more like a cautionary tale. The most famous, of course, was Charles II of Spain. Nicknamed the Bewitched. Which was a polite way of saying, we have no idea how this man is still alive. Charles had a jaw so prominent it could have been rented out as extra storage space. His tongue was so large he struggled to speak or chew properly. He drooled. He stumbled. He was chronically ill, and mentally, let's just say not particularly sharp. And yet, he was king. Because of course he was. You see, by the time Charles was born in 1661, his family had been intermarrying for generations. Uncle with niece. Cousin with cousin. Over and over. By some calculations, Charles had more ancestral overlap than most people would get from marrying their own sibling. His family tree could be drawn with a single crayon. And the results were catastrophic. He couldn't father children. His reign was marked by constant ill health. And when he finally died in 1700, without an heir, the entire Spanish branch of the Habsburg dynasty collapsed in on itself. Which, in hindsight, is what tends to happen when your dynasty is built on a foundation of double first cousins. But the Habsburgs weren't alone in this. Oh no! Across Europe, cousin marriage was the fashion accessory no monarch could resist. Take the Ptolemies of Egypt. They were at it centuries earlier, marrying brother to sister in true pharaonic style. Cleopatra herself, the famous one, married two of her brothers. Which, yes, does put a slightly different spin on all those romantic paintings. The logic was the same: keep the throne in the family. The result? Generations of rulers with more genetic problems than even the Habsburgs could manage. Or look at the Bourbon dynasty of France. Their inbreeding wasn't as severe, but the ripples were still there. Hemophilia, weak chins, fragile health. Monarchs who looked glamorous in oil paintings but couldn't walk up a flight of stairs without pausing for breath. And then we drift north, to the Tudors. Now, the Tudors themselves weren't especially inbred. Henry VIII was too busy producing heirs, or failing to, with a wide variety of wives. But his daughter Mary married her cousin Philip of Spain, tying the English crown firmly into that same Habsburg genetic soup. It was an immediate disaster, but it laid threads that would entangle England and Spain for generations. Of course, the irony is that all of this was meant to secure dynasties. To keep the bloodline strong. To keep power concentrated. Instead, it produced monarchs who could barely survive childhood. Kings who couldn't govern. Queens who couldn't produce heirs. Dynasties that looked invincible on paper but were fragile in flesh. Let's drift back to Charles II for a moment. His reign is almost a bedtime story in genetic inevitability. He was described by contemporaries as imbecile, short, weak, and constantly ill. He had epileptic fits. He was infertile. He struggled to chew food. And yet, foreign ambassadors had to kneel and bow, pretending this was all perfectly normal. Pretending that the shuffling, drooling king was still a symbol of divine order. It must have been exhausting. Then there's the Austrian Habsburgs, who carried the infamous Habsburg jaw like a family heirloom. Long chins, jutting mandibles, protruding lips. Painters did their best to flatter, but the jaw refused to be ignored. By the 17th century, some Habsburgs couldn't close their mouths properly. Not ideal when you're trying to look regal. And yet, the courts dressed it all up in ceremony. A king could barely walk unaided, but he was carried on a litter draped in cloth of gold. A queen might be frail and sickly, but she glittered in pearls. The body was failing, but the costume, was magnificent. It's a strange kind of theater, really. Dynasties crumbling from within, but still staging elaborate performances of power. A reminder that so much of monarchy was illusion. Fine silks covering weak bones. Trumpets blaring for rulers who could hardly string together a sentence. And the public? They played along. They had to. To question the monarch was to question God. Better to bow deeply, keep your eyes lowered, and whisper your jokes about the king's jawline in private. By the 18th century, some dynasties began to learn their lesson. Marrying outside the family, seeking healthier spouses. But the damage was already done. Centuries of cousin marriage had left its mark. And Europe's royal houses would never quite escape the shadows of those mistakes. So as we drift tonight, picture those portraits. The heavy-lidded eyes. The slack jaws. The pale, sickly children swaddled in velvet. All painted as though they were glorious, divine. All concealing the truth of dynasties quietly decaying from within. Fashion could cover it. Ceremonies could disguise it. But bloodlines, in the end, told their own story. And often, it was a sad one. Royal marriages that went horribly, genetically wrong. Hey everyone, let's keep gliding through the candlelit halls of history. We've lingered among the Habsburg jaws and cousinly unions, and now we'll drift into the other half of the story. Not just the inbreeding, but the marriages themselves. The alliances, the dynastic bargains, the grand matches made in heaven that so often produced children who struggled simply to stay alive. Because if there's one thing medieval and early modern monarchs loved more than velvet, it was marrying someone who shared at least one set of grandparents with them. It wasn't about love, of course. Love was something you were supposed to find in a lute ballad, or with a mistress. Marriage was about property. Borders. Armies. Keeping it in the family. Which, as we've seen, was sometimes taken far too literally. Let's start with the French. Always a reliable source of dynastic disaster. Charles VI of France, known, somewhat dramatically, as Charles the Mad. He married Isabeau of Bavaria, and together they produced a whole flock of children, many of whom were married off into other royal houses. But Charles himself had been the product of inbreeding, and he suffered frequent psychotic episodes. He believed he was made of glass. He would run screaming through the palace corridors, lashing out at servants, convinced they were plotting to shatter him. His marriage passed on a weak bloodline that rippled across France, contributing to instability for decades. A royal match meant to strengthen the crown instead helped pull it apart. Or consider the Habsburgs again. Because of course, it's always the Habsburgs. Joanna of Castile, better remembered by the slightly unkind nickname Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad. She married Philip the Handsome. A dazzling match on paper. Castile and Burgundy united. But genetically? A mess waiting to happen. Their son was Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, who inherited not just half of Europe but also the entire family jawline and a generous helping of hereditary instability. And poor Joanna herself unraveled under the strain. After Philip's sudden death, she reportedly clung to his body, refusing to bury him, dragging his coffin from place to place. Court gossip painted her as insane. Historians now suspect she may have suffered from severe depression or schizophrenia, possibly exacerbated by that lovely cocktail of Habsburg genetics. Either way, this grand political marriage produced a dynasty of rulers whose health was every bit as shaky as their alliances. Then there's the case of England and Spain. The famous marriage of Mary I of England to Philip II of Spain. On paper, a power couple. In reality, a catastrophe. Mary was in her late 30s, desperate for an heir. Philip was her cousin, younger, ambitious, and deeply unpopular in England. Their marriage was so disliked that it helped spark Wyatt's rebellion, a failed uprising against the crown. As for producing an heir, Mary experienced what we now call phantom pregnancies. Twice her belly swelled, her cravings shifted, her court prepared for a child, but no baby ever arrived. Likely, she was suffering from severe gynecological issues or even cancer. Either way, the union produced no children, no stability, and plenty of misery. And again, dynastic logic had triumphed over common sense. The marriage was meant to unite Catholic powers against Protestant threats. Instead, it left England bitter, divided, and heirless. Let's float over to Austria for a moment. Emperor Leopold I. He married his niece, Margaret Teresa of Spain. Yes, his niece. She was just 14 at the time. He was 26. Their marriage was celebrated with endless parades, operas, and courtly display. But genetically, it was a dead end. Margaret Teresa was already deeply inbred, a daughter of Philip IV of Spain and his own niece, Mariana of Austria. By the time she married Leopold, her family tree looked more like a knot. She bore 4 children, but only one survived to adulthood, and she herself died at just 21. The Habsburg obsession with keeping it all in the family had, once again, kept the coffin makers busy. The Spanish side of things kept getting worse. Charles II, whom we floated past earlier, was the ultimate product of these unions. His parents, Philip IV and Mariana, were uncle and niece. His body paid the price. And his marriage prospects were bleak. His first wife, Marie Louise of Orleans, reportedly adored him at first, but the reality of his condition soon turned the union into despair. They had no children. She died young, possibly from appendicitis, though whispers suggested she had been poisoned out of frustration. His second wife, Maria Anne of Neuburg, fared no better. She, too, produced no heir. The dynasty ended with Charles, who in his will more or less handed Spain over to the French Bourbons. A family tree that had been so carefully guarded collapsed in a single generation. But it wasn't only in Spain or Austria. Look at Portugal. King Afonso VI married Maria Francisca of Savoy. Afonso had been paralyzed on one side since childhood, possibly due to a stroke or meningitis. He was mentally unstable and incapable of consummating the marriage. After just 1 year, Maria Francisca managed to annul the union, marry his younger brother Pedro instead, and conveniently help overthrow Afonso in the process. A dynastic match meant to stabilize the crown instead ended in humiliation, scandal, and a deposed king. Or if we drift up to Denmark, King Christian VII. He married Caroline Matilda of Great Britain, the sister of George III. Christian was, to put it mildly, unwell. He suffered from severe mental illness, possibly schizophrenia. He was described as childish, unstable, prone to violent outbursts. Their marriage quickly fell apart. Caroline Matilda turned instead to Christian's physician, Johann Struensee, with whom she began an affair. She even had a daughter, rumored to be Struensee's child. The scandal consumed the Danish court, led to executions, and left Christian himself a hollow, broken figurehead. Again, the dynastic logic of marrying British and Danish crowns together had backfired in spectacularly tragic ways. What all of these stories share is the same melancholy rhythm. The marriages weren't about love. They weren't even about happiness. They were treaties with wedding veils. Contracts written in silk and sealed with rings. And time and again, they ended in sickness, infertility, scandal, or dynasties that withered away under the weight of their own bloodlines. And yet, the pageantry never faltered. Brides still arrived in velvet coaches, dripping in jewels. Grooms still posed in portraits, puffed with dignity. The music still played, the toasts were still raised, and the crowds still cheered. Even as everyone quietly suspected that the happy couple was doomed. So as we drift tonight, picture those ceremonies. Candlelit cathedrals echoing with vows. Young brides, trembling beneath golden crowns. Sickly grooms, struggling to stand tall. The union of kingdoms resting on shoulders that could barely hold their own heads upright. And all the while, courtiers whispering, hoping, pretending that this time, it might work out. It rarely did. The pettiest and most dysfunctional kings and queens. Hey everyone, let's keep going. By now, we've wandered through inbreeding, disastrous marriages, and dynasties that crumbled under their own weight. So it feels only natural to settle into something a little different tonight, pettiness. Because if there's one universal trait among kings and queens, it wasn't wisdom, or bravery, or even dignity. It was the ability to throw a tantrum on a scale only absolute power could allow. And the best part is, these were not small people. These were rulers of entire nations. Commanders of armies. Owners of crowns heavy enough to dent their foreheads. And yet, their behavior often resembled children bickering over toys. Or, more accurately, adults bickering over lands, mistresses, and which cousin had the shinier hat. Let's start with King John of England. You know, the one from Robin Hood. History has been unkind to him, and for good reason. John was petty in almost every possible way. He overtaxed his nobles, starved his opponents in dungeons, and seized property at the slightest insult. When one of his barons refused to pay him, John confiscated the man's land, tossed his family into prison, and allegedly starved the wife and son to death. Because that, apparently, was easier than negotiation. He's remembered as such a disaster that English nobles forced him to sign the Magna Carta, basically a medieval timeout document. John sulked, signed it, and then immediately tried to ignore it. Petty to the last breath. But if we want drama, let's move to France. Charles VI again. Yes, the same Charles the Mad we floated past earlier. His dysfunction was legendary. One day, while riding with his knights, he suddenly turned on them, slaughtering several in a paranoid frenzy. Another time, he refused to bathe or change clothes for months. Court attendants reported that he smelled so foul they could barely approach him. His queen, Isabeau, tried to manage the situation but spent most of her reign essentially babysitting a grown man who thought he was made of glass. Dysfunction doesn't quite cover it. And then there's Elizabeth I of England. Now, Elizabeth was brilliant in many ways. Politically savvy, witty, and remarkably effective at keeping her throne in a male-dominated world. But she was also vain. Painfully so. She had a habit of punishing courtiers who dared to mention her aging face. When one of her ladies-in-waiting got married without permission, Elizabeth reportedly slapped her, tore her hair out, and locked her in a room. She also became obsessed with elaborate makeup, coating her face in white lead that slowly poisoned her. The Virgin Queen may have ruled with intelligence, but her court lived in fear of her temper and her mirrors. Meanwhile, over in Russia, we find Ivan the Terrible. His very nickname is a bit of a giveaway. Ivan was brilliant and ruthless, but he also descended into paranoia and pettiness. He once killed his own son in a fit of rage, striking him with a staff. He would banish entire families for imagined insults, seize their estates, and then redistribute them to loyalists, only to change his mind later and seize them again. He even created his own private corps of black-clad enforcers, the Oprichniki, who terrorized the countryside on his behalf. Dysfunction wasn't just a personal trait for Ivan, it became government policy. Let's soften the candlelight and drift back to France, where Louis XIV, the so-called Sun King, reigned. Louis was the very embodiment of pettiness and high heels. He required every nobleman at court to attend his daily ritual of waking up, dressing, and eating breakfast. It was considered an honor to hand him his shirt. An even greater honor to hold the royal wash basin. Imagine the peak of European aristocracy reduced to squabbling over who got to hand a middle-aged man his socks. Louis reveled in it, because it reminded everyone who the real sun was in Versailles. And, naturally, it was him. Petty queens deserve their moment too. Catherine de' Medici of France, mother to 3 kings, had a reputation for poison. While not every story is true, she was certainly ruthless. She allegedly kept a collection of poisoned gloves and perfumes. One rival at court, Jeanne d'Albret, mysteriously fell ill after shopping in Paris and died soon after. Was it Catherine? Hard to prove. But the rumors suited her perfectly. Dysfunction wasn't just tolerated at court, it was fashionable. Then, if we glide towards Spain again, we find Philip II. A deeply devout man, but also obsessively controlling. He micromanaged his vast empire to the point of absurdity, personally reading endless reports from the New World. He became so bogged down in paperwork that decisions stalled for months. His reign produced famine, revolts, and a bankrupt treasury. He once spent weeks arguing over the proper color of a monastery's draperies. Imagine an empire stretching across oceans, and the king is stuck debating curtains. But perhaps the crown for dysfunction belongs to George III of Britain. Yes, the king remembered for losing the American colonies. George suffered from recurring bouts of madness, likely caused by porphyria. During his episodes, he would babble endlessly, talk to trees, and even attempt to shake hands with an oak, convinced it was the King of Prussia. His doctors tried bleeding him, restraining him, and even applying blistering treatments to his skin. None of it worked. His reign lurched between moments of lucidity and collapse, with his family and ministers trying to patch the monarchy together. Dysfunction had become a national crisis. What unites all of these rulers isn't just their flaws. It's how their flaws shaped history. John's tantrums gave us the Magna Carta. Charles VI's delusions helped spark the 100 Years' War. Elizabeth's vanity terrified her courtiers but also kept her throne secure. Ivan's paranoia reshaped Russia. Louis XIV's pettiness built Versailles into the world's most extravagant prison for the nobility. Catherine de' Medici's ruthlessness kept her children on the throne. Philip II's obsession with paperwork helped bankrupt Spain. George III's madness ushered in new models of regency. In their own way, every petty spat, every tantrum, every dysfunction echoed far beyond the palace walls. And yet, at their core, these were still human foibles. Pride. Fear. Vanity. The inability to share toys, scaled up to entire kingdoms. So as you drift tonight, imagine the scene, kings sulking in jewel-encrusted beds. Queens plotting in candlelit chambers. Courtiers whispering, terrified of an eye roll that might lead to exile. A world where dysfunction wasn't hidden, it was paraded, dressed in ermine, and written into the laws of nations. And the lesson, if there is one, is simple: power doesn't cure pettiness. It only gives it a throne. Sickly, spoiled, and sad, medieval royal childhoods. Hey everyone, tonight, let's slow the pace even more. We've wandered through punishments, bizarre marriages, and kings who couldn't stop sulking. Now, let's turn to something that sounds innocent, but wasn't. Royal childhoods. Because if you think being born into velvet and jewels meant an easy life, well, no. It often meant the opposite. Childhood, for a royal, was a mixture of privilege, sickness, and crushing expectation. Imagine growing up with nurses who wouldn't let you play outside because you might bruise, tutors who reminded you daily that you might inherit an entire kingdom, and dynastic plans that had you betrothed to some distant cousin before you even learned to walk. Let's begin with Edward VI of England. Poor Edward. He was the long-awaited son of Henry VIII and Jane Seymour. Born into fanfare, carried around in silks, and hailed as England's savior. Except, he was never healthy. Edward suffered from fevers, coughing fits, and what modern historians think was tuberculosis. His childhood was spent under constant medical attention, bled and purged by doctors who believed illness could be drained out. He became king at 9 years old, but he never really got to live like a child. By 15, he was dead. His reign is remembered less for achievements and more for the fragile, sad little boy who sat on a throne too big for him. Now, let's drift over to France. Louis XIV, the Sun King, had a very spoiled childhood. He was given miniature versions of adult clothing before he could even run properly. But spoiled didn't mean secure. During the civil wars of his youth, he was forced to flee Paris with his mother, Anne of Austria. There were nights when the young Louis supposedly slept on straw, surrounded by frightened attendants. That early brush with danger shaped him for life. Later, as king, Louis never forgave Paris for scaring him as a child. Versailles, the glittering palace, was built partly so he'd never have to live among his people again. A palace born from childhood trauma. Another sad figure is Mary, Queen of Scots. She was sent away to France at just 5 years old, betrothed to the young Dauphin. A child, living in a foreign court, paraded as a royal prize. While other children played with toys, Mary was groomed to charm ambassadors. Her letters hint at homesickness, and though she grew tall, elegant, and clever, her life was marked by a sense of displacement. Her childhood ended before it began. And her adulthood, as we know, didn't end much better. Let's pause in Spain for Don Carlos, the son of Philip II. Don Carlos had what we might politely call a troubled youth. In reality, he was sickly, mentally unstable, and violent. As a boy, he suffered a head injury that left him increasingly erratic. He abused servants, tortured animals, and terrified his tutors. Instead of therapy, he got more tutors. Instead of care, he got betrothal negotiations. Eventually, his father locked him up, declaring him too dangerous to rule. Don Carlos died at just 23, half forgotten in a palace prison. His childhood had been nothing more than the prelude to confinement. Then there's Richard II of England. A boy king who inherited the throne at 10 years old. From the start, his reign was shaped by others, uncles, advisors, power-hungry nobles. As a child, he was taught to see himself as almost divine. This, unfortunately, didn't prepare him for adulthood, when other nobles reminded him that divinity wasn't enough. He grew up arrogant, sensitive to slights, and deeply insecure. His downfall, overthrown and imprisoned, was seated in that childhood of unrealistic adoration. But sometimes, being spoiled was as destructive as being sickly. Take Henry VI of England. His childhood was cushioned with piety and tutors who emphasized religion over politics. He grew up gentle, timid, and deeply unsuited to kingship. When civil war broke out, what we now call the Wars of the Roses, Henry was incapable of strong leadership. He slipped into bouts of catatonia, sometimes unable to speak or recognize people for months. His sad, sheltered childhood hadn't prepared him for the brutal reality of ruling. Royal daughters didn't fare much better. Isabella of Castile, famous later for financing Columbus, spent her youth under constant threat from rival claimants. Her childhood was marked by poverty compared to other royals, sometimes lacking proper clothing or food because her half-brother, the king, neglected her household. Yet that difficult childhood forged her determination. When she finally took power, she ruled with a steel edge that came from never forgetting what it felt like to be powerless. And in the Holy Roman Empire, Charles V had one of the strangest upbringings of all. He was born in Ghent, raised by a series of guardians, and constantly shuffled between courts. Each region spoke a different language, so Charles grew up speaking French, Dutch, Spanish, and later German, though he never mastered any perfectly. His letters as a teenager reveal a lonely boy, more comfortable with horses and hunting than with people. And yet, this displaced child would one day rule an empire where the sun never set. His fractured childhood mirrored the fractured lands he governed. So what do we learn from all this? That royal childhoods were rarely innocent. They were training grounds, dynastic experiments, or simply medical tragedies. These children weren't raised to be happy. They were raised to serve thrones, alliances, and power struggles far bigger than themselves. As you drift tonight, picture the scene: small figures in over-decorated gowns, reciting Latin to stern tutors. Pale, coughing heirs tucked into enormous beds with velvet canopies, surrounded by anxious physicians with leeches. Little princesses being told they were destined for kings they'd never met. And sometimes, frightened children shivering in cold castles, already pawns in games they couldn't understand. Childhood, for them, wasn't playtime. It was politics. And far too often, it was sad. Strange habits and petty meltdowns of royals. Hey everyone, settle in again. We've seen sickly children, fragile bloodlines, and kings who couldn't quite cope with reality. Now let's loosen the velvet curtain a little further and peek at one of the most human sides of monarchy: the strange little habits, and the very petty meltdowns, that shaped the reputations of kings and queens. Because behind the jeweled crowns and solemn portraits, royals were still people. And like all people, they had quirks. The difference is that when you or I sulk about dinner, no one writes it down. But when a monarch sulks, entire nations may notice. Let's begin with Peter the Great of Russia. He is remembered for modernizing Russia, for building St. Petersburg, and for towering over almost everyone he met. But Peter also had a habit of personally pulling teeth. He traveled with his own dentist's kit and would ask courtiers if they had any aching molars. Many of them, terrified of saying no, simply opened their mouths and let him yank. Sometimes, he pulled healthy teeth just for the experience. A strange, hands-on hobby for a czar. Now, let's drift to Charles VI of France, known as Charles the Mad. One of his strangest habits was believing he was made of glass. He insisted on wearing reinforced clothing and refused to let people touch him in case he shattered. He even ordered iron rods sewn into his garments for protection. Imagine the royal tailors trying to politely suggest that the king was not, in fact, a wine goblet. This fragile self-image made him deeply unpredictable, and his meltdowns left France politically shattered too. Over in Spain, Philip II had his own brand of pettiness. He was obsessive about paperwork. He micromanaged so thoroughly that reports piled up in his study, sometimes left unread for months. Yet he insisted everything passed through his hands. His subjects sometimes joked that Spain's empire collapsed under the weight of Philip's filing system. Not a dramatic meltdown, just a slow suffocation of governance by one man's compulsive need to control every sheet of paper. Elizabeth I of England had her quirks too. She loved sweet things, so much that her teeth famously blackened. But her real meltdowns came over matters of marriage. Whenever Parliament pressed her to wed, she grew furious, lashing out at counselors who dared to suggest she needed a husband. Once, she stormed out of the chamber, declaring herself married only to England. A romantic line in hindsight, but at the time, it was the outburst of a woman tired of being treated like a political pawn. Let's not forget Frederick William I of Prussia, also called the Soldier King. He had a habit of collecting unusually tall soldiers. He formed an entire regiment of giants, men over 6 feet tall, which in the 18th century was extraordinary. He scouted Europe for tall peasants, purchased them from other rulers, and sometimes forced his own subjects into service simply because they grew too much. He paraded them like prized animals, and the taller the better. His obsession with height was, perhaps, a royal quirk at its most absurd. Meanwhile, Louis XI of France, nicknamed the Spider King, was notorious for petty behavior. He often wore a shabby old hat filled with lead images of saints, believing it gave him divine protection. He sulked, schemed, and indulged in sudden rages. Once, in a fit of paranoia, he imprisoned astrologers because he feared their predictions. His rule was tangled with suspicion, much like the spider he was compared to. Speaking of paranoia, Ivan the Terrible of Russia had meltdowns that were anything but small. He He often erupted in fits of rage, attacking boyars and servants alike. His strangest habit was retreating into a private room to pray for hours, alternating between religious devotion and violent temper. One infamous meltdown ended with him striking his own son in anger, an act that left Ivan horrified when the boy died. A tragic example of a royal temper taken too far. Then there's George III of Britain. Popularly remembered for his madness, George actually had long stretches of lucidity. But during his breakdowns, he developed strange habits. He talked incessantly, sometimes for hours, and would write long, rambling letters filled with capital letters and underlining. At his lowest points, he believed he was conversing with angels. His doctors bled him, restrained him, and subjected him to treatments that likely worsened his state. His meltdowns, documented in detail, became political crises as much as personal tragedies. Some quirks were less tragic, more amusing. James I of England, for example, was terrified of assassination. After Guy Fawkes and the Gunpowder Plot, he became obsessed with witchcraft and the occult. He wrote a whole book on demonology, convinced that witches were plotting against him. He also hated bathing, which, given the period, wasn't entirely unique, but it didn't help his reputation as a nervous, fussy monarch. And finally, let's mention Catherine de' Medici. She had a habit of surrounding herself with astrologers and poison experts. She carried charms and consulted horoscopes before making political decisions. While this may have given her confidence, it also fed the image of her as a scheming, sinister queen. In reality, much of it was superstition, but her court's whispering turned it into legend. So, what do we make of these quirks? Some were harmless, like collecting tall men or hoarding saint charms. Others, like paranoid meltdowns or violent rages, reshaped entire kingdoms. In all cases, they remind us that royals were not the flawless figures painted in oil portraits. They were human, painfully so. Petty, anxious, obsessive, and often very strange. Picture it as you drift tonight, monarchs pacing gilded halls, muttering about paperwork, clinging to charms, or sulking because Parliament dared to suggest marriage. Kings convinced they were glass, queens weeping into lace, emperors pulling teeth for fun. Strange habits woven into the tapestry of power, leaving behind a trail of oddities history has carefully preserved. Because in the end, crowns didn't erase eccentricity. They only made it louder. When crowns cracked, monarchs who lost their minds. Hey everyone, let's keep the candles low and our voices softer now. We've wandered through strange habits and petty meltdowns, and now we'll drift into something heavier, though still quietly fascinating: the kings and queens who lost their grip on reality. Monarchs whose crowns shone brightly, but whose minds, over time, cracked under the weight. Because mental illness doesn't spare the powerful. In fact, being cloistered in palaces, bowed to by everyone, and carrying the burden of dynasties probably made it worse. And when kings went mad, entire nations had to adjust, sometimes pretending nothing was wrong, other times tiptoeing around the royal rages. Let's begin with Charles VI of France, who we've already met briefly as the king who believed he was made of glass. His episodes were frequent, and they frightened everyone around him. Sometimes he forgot who he was and ran screaming through the halls. Other times, he refused to be touched, convinced the smallest bump would shatter him into shards. Courtiers began carrying him gently, swaddled as though he really were fragile porcelain. His breakdowns split France politically, giving rise to rival factions that plunged the kingdom into deeper chaos. His madness wasn't just personal, it reshaped the 100 Years' War. Over in England, Henry VI was another fragile soul. Crowned as a child, he was never particularly strong-minded. As an adult, he drifted into catatonic silence. During one episode, he sat motionless for more than a year, not speaking, not responding, not even recognizing his own wife and newborn son. Imagine the court dinners, everyone politely pretending the king was fine while he stared blankly into the fire. His condition left England vulnerable, fueling the Wars of the Roses. A king absent in mind, though still breathing in body. And then we reach Joanna of Castile, better remembered by the cruel nickname Joanna the Mad. Her story is particularly sad. Married to Philip the Handsome, she loved him fiercely, far more than he loved her. When he died unexpectedly, Joanna's grief spiraled into obsession. She traveled with his coffin, opening it to gaze upon his body, sometimes in the dead of night. Rumors spread that she kissed the corpse, though historians suspect exaggeration. Still, her devotion was unsettling enough that her family declared her unfit to rule, locking her away for decades. Was she truly mad, or simply broken by grief? Hard to say. But the crown was taken from her all the same. Now let's drift north, to Christian VII of Denmark. He came to the throne in the 18th century, but his reign was dominated by mental illness. He suffered from paranoia, erratic behavior, and compulsive habits. He would slap himself, run through the palace shrieking, and sometimes could not distinguish reality from fantasy. His court quietly shifted power away from him, letting advisors rule in his name. One of them, his physician, even carried on an affair with the queen, something Christian was too fragile to truly confront. In the end, he was a king in name, but little more. We can't forget George III of Britain. His madness has become one of history's most famous cases. At his worst, he babbled for hours, foamed at the mouth, and had fits of mania. He wrote rambling letters in bright ink, filled with underlining and strange capitalizations. Doctors bled him, blistered him, and dosed him with arsenic, treatments that may have worsened his suffering. Modern research suggests he had porphyria, a metabolic disorder, though bipolar disorder is also debated. What's certain is that his breakdowns frightened his family and destabilized his kingdom. He became the monarch whose mind, once sharp, unraveled in front of the world. In Russia, Ivan the Terrible, though perhaps never truly mad in a medical sense, slid into paranoia so deep it consumed him. He trusted no one, believed conspiracies lurked behind every door, and lashed out in violent rages. His most infamous outburst came when he struck his own son in anger, killing the heir he had once cherished. The painting of that moment, showing Ivan cradling his dying child in horror, is one of history's most haunting images of a crown cracking under the weight of its own fury. Another tragic figure was Emperor Rudolph II of the Holy Roman Empire. He retreated into isolation, refusing to meet his ministers, neglecting state affairs while obsessing over art and alchemy. His court filled with astrologers, magicians, and eccentric thinkers, while the empire itself slid into disorder. He was a collector, not just of paintings but of bizarre artifacts, filling his palace with wonders while ignoring political reality. By the end, his family staged a coup, stripping him of power while he shuffled quietly among his oddities. We might also whisper about Maria I of Portugal, remembered as Maria the Mad. After her husband and eldest son died in quick succession, grief consumed her. She wailed during church services, shrieked at night, and wandered the palace in despair. Her courtiers tried to maintain dignity, but eventually, she was declared insane, and her son ruled in her stead. She lived long enough to see Napoleon's wars force her court to flee to Brazil, carried along as a fragile shadow of the queen she once was. What unites all these stories is the uneasy balance between power and fragility. When an ordinary person lost their mind in the Middle Ages, they were hidden away, pitted, or ignored. When a monarch cracked, entire kingdoms trembled. Ministers schemed, regents stepped in, wars broke out, and dynasties shifted. Madness in a crown wasn't private, it was political. And yet, in the quiet of their chambers, these kings and queens were simply human. Charles, convinced he was glass. Henry, lost in silence. Joanna, weeping over her husband's coffin. George, writing endless sentences in purple ink. They remind us that behind the pomp, even the most exalted rulers were vulnerable to the same fragile mind as anyone else. So as you drift tonight, imagine the flicker of candles in cold stone halls. Courtiers whispering anxiously, doctors preparing another useless remedy, a monarch staring blankly into the fire. Crowns gleaming, but minds unraveling. The image is haunting, but also deeply human. Because even in gilded palaces, the mind can falter. And when it does, the crown alone cannot hold it together. Poison, perfume, and peculiar cures of royal courts. Hey everyone, if you're still with me under the blankets, or maybe already halfway into sleep, let's keep the candle burning low and wander into another curious corner of royal life. Tonight we'll drift through the potions, perfumes, and peculiar medical treatments that kings and queens endured. Because when you're wealthy, powerful, and vaguely terrified of dying, you'll try just about anything. especially if it smells faintly of roses or arsenic. Medicine in royal courts was a curious blend of superstition, half-truths, and very confident guesswork. Monarchs wanted to appear invincible, and yet they spent much of their lives terrified of invisible threats, plague, poison, or the ill winds of a bad horoscope. And so, their cures tended to be creative. Let's start with the ever-popular obsession with poison. Courts across Europe lived in constant fear of it. Poison was discreet, elegant, and effective. Unlike an assassin with a sword, a cup of tainted wine could slip silently into a banquet. So rulers armed themselves with antidotes. One of the most famous was Mithridate, named after King Mithridates VI of Pontus, who was said to have swallowed small amounts of poison daily until he was immune. Naturally, later royals tried to copy this. They carried little jars of complex antidote pastes, blends of herbs, minerals, and sometimes downright questionable substances like ground-up gems or bits of mummy. Because yes, powdered mummy was considered medicinal. Nothing says health like a spoonful of ancient desiccated pharaoh. Perfumes, too, weren't just about smelling nice. In an age when disease was believed to travel through bad air, sweet scents were thought to ward off illness. During outbreaks of plague, kings and queens stuffed their chambers with roses, lavender, or pungent vinegar-soaked sponges. Doctors would recommend that patients inhale musk, ambergris, or even smoke from burning herbs. The smell may not have cured anything, but at least the palace reeked of expensive flowers while everyone panicked. Now, peculiar cures. Brace yourself gently, because some are a little unsettling. Bloodletting was perhaps the most common. If you had a fever, the royal physicians would confidently declare that your humors were unbalanced, and the solution was obvious: remove some of your blood. Monarchs submitted to this repeatedly, growing pale and weak, but somehow convinced it was helping. Henry VIII, bloated and unhealthy near the end of his reign, was constantly bled, though one suspects it didn't do much for his famously infected leg wound. Then there were cures involving gold. Drinking gold water, tiny flakes of the metal suspended in liquid, was thought to strengthen the heart and spirit. Catherine de' Medici, Queen of France, was particularly fond of such concoctions, no doubt dazzling her physicians with the idea that her bloodstream should glimmer like her jewelry. And of course, urine had its moment. Yes, royal doctors sometimes prescribed it, claiming that certain types, collected under the right astrological sign, of course, had healing properties. To drink, to bathe in, or to dab politely on wounds. Naturally, monarchs rarely endured this themselves. More often it was tested on unfortunate servants or courtiers. We should also whisper about the more extreme concoctions: crushed emeralds, pearls dissolved in vinegar, or bezoar stones. Bezoars were strange clumps of undigested matter taken from the stomachs of animals, believed to neutralize any poison. Kings carried them like magical charms. Charles IX of France owned one, proudly displayed it at feasts, and once dipped it in a poisoned cup to prove its worth. It didn't work. Luckily, he had someone else drink it. Sometimes the peculiar cures overlapped with sheer indulgence. Louis XIV, the Sun King, was prescribed enemas for nearly everything, from headaches to indigestion. He reportedly underwent thousands in his lifetime, reclining on golden furniture while doctors inserted herbal infusions. Meanwhile, his court politely pretended this was dignified medicine. Perfumed gloves were another strange medical fashion. Monarchs believed that fragrant leather would protect them from infection. Elizabeth I of England wore them constantly, presenting them as gifts, while quietly believing the perfumed oils would keep plague at bay. In reality, it was more about looking stylish while still being terrified of death. And then, poisons themselves could be fashionable. Renaissance Italy, particularly in the Medici and Borgia circles, was obsessed with poison as both weapon and medicine. Some court ladies carried small vials of arsenic, disguised as perfume. A spritz here or a dab there could topple rivals discreetly. It was all very elegant, if you ignored the foaming and convulsions. What's striking is how often the line between cure and curse blurred. Was that vial of powder protecting you, or slowly killing you? Was that sweet-smelling glove a shield, or just a scented placebo? Royals trusted their physicians, but those physicians were armed mostly with confidence and a well-decorated cabinet of jars. Still, there's something oddly comforting in the thought. Even kings and queens, with all their wealth, lay awake at night terrified of a cough, or a rumor of poison, or the wrong alignment of Mars. They clutched their charms, sipped their mithridate, dabbed on their perfume, and hoped it would all be enough. So as you drift deeper into sleep tonight, picture a quiet bedchamber lit by flickering candlelight. A worried monarch lies beneath velvet covers, while a physician hovers nearby with a silver spoon of powdered pearls, a vial of unicorn horn, and a jar that smells faintly of lavender. Outside, the world waits. Inside, the cure is being administered, peculiar though it may be. Because in royal courts, medicine wasn't about science, it was about hope, luxury, and the faint perfume of reassurance. Even if it did nothing at all.